people have often asked me, what's the solution? What's the solution to these distressing climate emotions? What's the solution? How can we get young people to want to have children or feel good about children? The solution is to address climate change. I mean, the emotions aren't the problem at all. Yeah. And the reproductive concerns aren't the problem. Climate change is the problem. And our political and economic systems are the problem. Living in fossil fuel economies, that's the problem.
I'm Keltie McGuire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Today's podcast is delving into something that I personally have been feeling quite a bit these last few years, and that is climate anxiety and climate change. I know I'm not the only one who is feeling stressed, to say the least, when I look at the world around us and the impacts that we are having on our environment, and when I think about the future and what that future may hold. And I know for me personally, it was a factor that certainly weighed into my kids or child-free decision, one that I had to grapple with and consider. And it's one that I hear from a lot of you. What do I make of our current state of affairs where it concerns climate and the environment and this kids or child-free decision? So when I came across today's guest and her new book, I immediately begged her to come onto the podcast. Luckily, I didn't have to grovel too much. She joyfully said yes. And today we're going to be talking with her about these topics: the kids or child-free choice, climate change, and climate anxiety. Dr. Jade S. Sasser is Associate Professor in the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of California, Riverside. She received her PhD in Environmental Science, Policy, and Management from the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Sasser's work explores how environmental problems such as climate change and toxic exposures intersect with reproductive bodies, health, and rights. Her first book, On Infertile Ground: Population Control and Women's Rights in the Area of Climate Change, was published in 2018 by NYU Press and won the Emory Elliott Book Award. Her new book, Climate Anxiety and the Kid Question: Deciding Whether to Have Children in an Uncertain Future, analyzes the relationship between climate emotions, social inequality, and reproductive anxiety in the U.S. Jade also has a podcast with the same name, and in her free time, she's a DJ at her campus radio station. Thank you for being here. I once again did the thing where I have a really amazing conversation with my guest before we hit record. And finally, Jade said, "Are we recording this?" And I said, "Yeah, let's do all the listeners a favor and make sure they don't miss too much of this wonderful conversation that we've already embarked on." So right off the top, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me on this show. And yes, I have already been enjoying our conversation, so I'm sure it will be great. My name is Jade Sasser. I am an associate professor of gender and sexuality studies and am now also in the Department of Society, Environment, and Health Equity at UC Riverside. I have a new book that we are going to talk about today. I also have a podcast that I wrapped up on this book, and I more recently just started a brand new project, which we might touch on too. It's on these same issues where I'm working with a group of young climate activists to interview and survey other young climate activists on their climate emotions and whether their activism actually benefits them or makes them more worried about climate change.
I definitely would love to talk about that. So I'm going to make sure to circle back. I mean, I want to talk about all those things, but I think that's something that, correct me if I'm wrong, came out a little bit in the book in terms of how people who are really engaged in activism, I think as people who might not be as engaged, we like to think that that helps provide more optimism and hopefulness and the sense of doing something. And yet it seemed to maybe not be the case.
Well, it does, but it's more complicated than that. So it's both true that some of the most climate anxious people are the people who know the most about it. But it also is true that people who are intentional about finding community, finding joy, and, managing and navigating climate anxiety are those who know that that's something that they have to do, that they cannot take for granted.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm excited to hear more about that project. And I just remembered as you were talking that I actually think that was talked about in the podcast, which I did listen to a few episodes of the podcast. So we want to talk about the book. I want you to go buy yourself a copy of the book, listeners. And I'm always really happy and impressed when I have people message me saying, I bought the book you recommended and I read it and I liked it. And I'm like, oh, that's didn't know I had this much clout. So you're going to buy the book. You're going to listen to the podcast. Tell us what the book's called, Jade.
The book is called Climate Anxiety and the Kid Question, Deciding Whether to Have Children in an Uncertain Future. And the podcast is by the same name, just that first part, not the part after the colon.
Okay. When I heard and read about, discovered your work, this book, I was like, my literal message to Jade was like, oh my God, you have to come on the podcast. This is perfect. You're the person we need to talk to about this topic. And of course, this question of, first of all, I know everyone listening, or most of you listening, are on the fence about whether to not to have kids. And there are a lot of factors that play into it, but climate change and the environment is certainly a big one for a lot of people. And my guess is that today we're not going to give you any specific directives in terms of what you should be deciding as a result of it, but we are going to be touching on some different aspects and factors, I guess, as they intersect with climate change, this decision. No, spoiler, it's not just you who's worried. If you're thinking like, should I be bringing kids into this world? Is this the thing that I want to be doing? So we're going to get into all of that and more. Maybe first of all, you can just tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it and what the book is all about.
So the book is about how people of reproductive age are grappling with their emotions and mental health impacts arising from their concerns about climate change, and how all of that factors into the really complicated decisions about having children, whether to have children, when to have children, why to have children or not. As you said, there are no directives. I do not tell people to have kids or to not have kids. And it's important for me to say that because I think that often when people know what I write about, they make assumptions. They make assumptions that I tell people not to have children because of climate change. And that is absolutely not the case. I'm a researcher, so I study what other people are thinking and feeling and saying and doing, and then I analyze that and bring it to the public. And so this is a book that is based on research. It started when, back in 2019, I was having a conversation with someone who I had just met, and we were talking about that person's book project. And then after we were done talking about that, I said, well, tell me more about what you do. This person is a climate mental health expert. She researches all of the ongoing ways in which climate change and climate impacts, and specifically climate disasters, are really changing experiences of mental health among young people. And so I was really fascinated by that conversation. And then she turned to the direct impacts on reproductive anxiety and reproductive plans. And as someone who has been thinking about and researching and writing about reproductive justice and reproductive politics for a long time, I found myself really surprised because I had never thought about environmental emotions or climate anxiety or climate change and mental health. Those things had never come together in any formal way in my mind. And when I went away and really started to do the research, I said, oh my gosh, this makes a lot of sense as a connection to why people who are deeply concerned about and engaged with environmental problems also transfer those concerns and engagements to how they feel about having children. In the past, I assumed that it was based on a concern about population growth, or that these concerns were only common among people who feel that population control is a good environmental strategy. But that's not necessarily the case at all. It's rather, what kind of future would any children that I would bring into the world, what kind of future would they live in? What kind of environment, what kind of planet would I be bringing them into? And more to the point, what kind of moral and ethical decisions would I have to make to be okay with bringing them into a situation that I know is this bad and will continue to be worse? So that's what the book is about. It's a set of interviews with young people about those emotions and feelings and plans. And then also a national survey that I did on the same topic.
I love that there was both the qualitative and quantitative research data, and I really appreciated and enjoyed those different interviews. And for myself, I'm 42 years old, and a lot of the women that I coach who are stuck on this decision are in their mid late 30s, early 40s even. They really feel that crunch of like, I've got to make a decision, and ideally sooner than later. For me, it was especially interesting, perhaps not knowing a ton of people, or at least conversing on this topic with them, who are, call it, in their early 20s or late teens, and hearing, I guess, what they share is not necessarily surprising, but at the same time, it made me quite profoundly sad to just hear how distressed this, I guess, Gen Z, Gen Z, depending what country you're from, how you say the letter. I always forget which one is Canadian and which one is American, but probably one's British, and the same as the Canadian one. But yeah, so it was really interesting giving quite literal voice to different people as it concerns this both reproductive question and, should or do I want to, or will I have children, as well as the environmental piece. And specifically, as you said, and we'll talk about some of the other factors that tie in, but through this lens of like emotion, anxiety. What I'm curious to know is, did you write this book for people then who are making this decision, who are grappling with whether or not to have children, or was it written for the policymakers, for other people who've maybe already had children, like to kind of be like, hey guys, this is what's happening right now. This is what's going on. Or who was the both? Okay.
It was for both. I wanted people who are grappling with this decision to feel seen and heard, mainly because in so many conversations I was having, even before I started formally interviewing people for the book, in so many conversations I was having, people were telling me that they had never spoken to anyone about their feelings about climate change and having children, because they didn't want to be dismissed. They didn't want their concerns to be minimized or downplayed or disregarded. They had had a lot of experiences with parents and older adults, sort of dismissing their concerns and telling them to go ahead and have children anyway, telling them that there's never a perfect time, telling them that these environmental issues or environmental concerns will resolve themselves. And so the people I was talking to were very clear that those things were not the case. They felt there was a strong disconnect generationally in terms of knowledge of climate change, climate literacy and awareness, and direct engagement with climate-related science and other kinds of communication, such that, young people are aware this is not just going to go away at all. And so part of it was I wanted to get it right. I wanted to really take the words and the voices and the concerns of people who had trusted some of their deepest fears. I wanted to get that on the page and really accurately represent what I know to be a very real and very common widespread phenomena among young people. And at the same time, I wanted to talk to people my age and older. I'm sort of what's called a Zennial. I was born at the end of Gen X, but in this little teeny tiny window, not quite a millennial, not fully a Gen Xer. There's like this 4-year period of transition where we're called Zennials.
What years is that? Now I'm curious.
1977 to 1980. It's a really short time, but for some reason, we're a weird little sandwich generation. Yeah. And so I feel like I understand very well the concerns of the people whose experiences that I document in the book, even though I am at an age where, reproductive decisions are not pressing concerns for me anymore. They were quite recently. But I also really relate to Gen Xers and boomers who say, we didn't grow up with climate change. Climate change is something that we came into an awareness of at an older age. For Gen Xers, high school, college, that's when climate change conversations started. And it was always framed as something that will happen in the future, not in the now. The difference generationally is that those in Gen Z and younger millennials have a very strong awareness that they were born into this situation and that climate change shapes the conditions of their lives for their entire lifetime. And that is not something that can be pushed off to some future date to address. So that generational difference in awareness about climate change is really important. And I wanted this book to educate older generations to help them understand that there is an evidence base that shows that young people's concerns are real, they are valid, they are based on science, there are researchers exploring this, and that if we want to understand and align with and support young people, we have to take their experiences seriously.
Yeah.
And if possible, I want policymakers to get on board too. I think I'm less convinced that that will happen, but maybe it will.
You never know. Let us know if you hold the key to making those changes. But I think although I'm certainly much older than many of the people, or probably most of the people you interviewed in the book, I certainly found a lot of my own fears and concerns echoed there. And it was very reaffirming. And at the same time, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, there were different issues where it concerns this intersection of reproductive decision-making and climate change that I had not considered before, that I think were, really important for me to become aware of. What I would love, I don't know if you have, and now I'm going to ask you to go back to the recesses of your memory, but do you have a couple of key facts or data points that may just help frame this conversation in terms of where people are at with regards to having or not having kids and climate change and specifically climate anxiety?
Yes. So this actually, I won't go back to, because this just came out. This is someone else's data, but literally this came out about a week ago. So there was a recent study done here in the US surveying 16,000 people 18 to 25 years old. It's the largest survey of its kind. And it was assessing their environmental emotions, how they feel about climate change, mental health, impacts of climate change. And one of the questions they asked was how they felt about having children. What was really interesting is that they surveyed people across the political spectrum, because here in the US, climate change is seen as a political issue, not a scientific one, which is wild to me. But so they surveyed Democrats, independents, and Republicans. And what they found, unsurprisingly to me, is that in that age group, people across the board are deeply distressed and worried and concerned about climate change. More people who identify as Democrats express those concerns, but there was still a significant majority of Republicans, young Republicans, that feel that way too. The most commonly identified emotions were anxiety, concern, and fear. And that fear is really important. In the survey that I conducted, fear was the emotion that was most associated with how people link their climate emotions to how they feel about being parents. Also, from that survey of 16,000 young people in the US, they found that a majority across the board expressed concern about having children and doubt that they ever will have children because of their feelings about climate change. I also want to say, I want to introduce the fact that this is also an issue of inequality too. Yeah. Not all people experience climate change itself or their emotional responses to climate change in the same way. So there's research that has been done by the Yale Center for Climate Communication that has found that Black and Hispanic communities in the United States are consistently more concerned and more worried about climate change. And then they did a series of surveys in 2023 that found that Black and Hispanic populations in the US were more likely to have diagnosable mental health conditions, specifically anxiety and depression, that they self-report as being associated with climate change. So there's a clear and documentable component in which one's demographic lived experience shapes these concerns.
And if I understand it correctly, this is something that's really unique about your book, because apparently a lot of the research that's been done historically has not looked at the intersection of things like race being a big one, but other people's lived experiences or current demographic with climate change. And that's something that you wanted to explore and look at differently. Can you tell me about how you came to realize this and what I guess that what made you shift and realize, whether it was personally or professionally, that you needed to take a different standpoint?
Well, I knew and had known from the research for years that climate change impacts communities differently along the lines of race and class in the United States. So we've had an environmental justice movement since the 60s and 70s. It wasn't named environmental justice until the 1980s, but there is so much research that demonstrates that your zip code really shapes and determines your health outcomes, your lived experience, your exposure to toxins, etc. And as we have more research and data about climate change, the ability to recover from climate impacts is shaped by these demographic factors. The distribution of recovery and relief aid is distributed along these demographic lines of how communities are made up. And even how communities experience climate impact in the first place. In the US, these communities that are known as historically redlined communities are likely to be at least 10 degrees hotter than communities around them. And redlined communities are communities that have been shaped by a history of racial segregation. And so I knew that communities of color and low-income communities experience these impacts. And I had started to do the research to understand that these impacts also have emotional impacts too, which just kind of makes common sense, but it's it's helpful that those surveys have been done too. And so for me, I said, okay, so people are starting to connect these questions to reproductive concerns. Let me see what's written about race there. There was nothing. Dead silence. I couldn't believe it. And I thought, how could you not ask this question? So there were a few very small surveys that had been done about environmental concerns and reproductive concerns. And the thing that really struck me about those surveys is that not only was race not kind of a central concern in the analysis, but people of color were underrepresented vastly and dramatically relative to our numbers in the broader society. And so I thought, oh no, this is really telling a story that we don't care or that we are not represented in this issue or this set of concerns. And honestly, I felt a sense of outrage, especially given the disproportionate climate impacts on communities of color. Why would you think that we don't care about this? So that's a big part of why I included that focus in the book.
Okay. And so what were some of the key discoveries then that you made in terms of what reproductive decision-making is looking like and how that's being taken in consideration in light of climate change, specifically where you concern this intersection of race and other categories that you explored?
So I would say that the main takeaway is this: for people who are experiencing emotional distress about climate change, that emotional distress often factors into emotional distress about having children. It doesn't mean that people who are distressed about climate change don't want children. It doesn't mean that they won't have children. It means that distress is a factor that will factor in. Now, where race and demographics come into the picture are this question of, are there other ongoing stressors, concerns, aspects of experience and identity that make it hard to feel good about having children? And what happens when you layer stressor upon stressor upon stressor and climate change sort of comes in and presses down on all of it. And that was something that I heard a lot in the interviews for the book. When I think about some of the people I interviewed, the most common emotion that they felt when thinking about climate change and having children was overwhelmed. And so overwhelm is not a light emotion. Overwhelmed is how you feel.
Very heavy and oppressive.
Heavy and oppressive, and it's how you feel after you have been really thinking about it, maybe even ruminating on something for a long time, and feel that it is really weighing down on you. These were folks who also described other emotions: depression, anxiety, worry, concern. They were concerned about their ongoing mental health, even aside from climate change or aside from questions of parenting. But it was when these issues came together for them. How will I manage my own future? How will I manage future finances, relationships, career, the ability to own a house someday? How will I manage my own mental health? And on top of that, with climate change pressing down and making me worried about what the future looks like for me and any child that I would bring into the world, how can I feel good and confident about parenting in a future like that? Those were the concerns that are at the heart of this book that were shared by so many young people. And yet, please let me do say, because this interview will sound very, very heavy, and like the book is very, very heavy.
It's not. It's a great laugh.
But the truth of the matter is that even in the midst of all of these challenges, there were those in the book who were making a clear, firm commitment to joy and to having children as a part of an expression of joy. One person in particular who had suffered a lot of negative mental health impacts as she struggled with the decision to have children or not, she and her husband decided to have a child. They decided that having that child was their way of rejecting fear, embracing joy, and they had to completely reorganize their lives as a result. They left where they had been living. They didn't really have a community of support around them, so they left and they moved back home to Canada to
Good
be
country,
near.
I hear.
I hear the same. To be near her family and her community, and to be in a space where they felt that they had mental and emotional support, a strong community, strong network, and could really provide a child with all of the resources that are needed to face this ongoing crisis. So I do want to make that clear. There are several people who have had children after the book and have been happy about that and have a perspective on, looking back at their interviews. They feel strongly that having children was the right thing for them, and that they are glad that they expressed these concerns because it changed the way that they approach parenting.
Yeah. I want to highlight that as well as what you share about, this sort of idea of having a child as like an act of hope or optimism and embracing joy. And so we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But I want to delve into, even this example you just gave is a perfect way of highlighting how all these different sort of factors and layers intersect where it concerns their reproductive decision-making question, as well as climate change. Because And I think it also is, to kind of paraphrase what you said, it's not just about whether people wanted kids or not. It's just taking into account what is having a child or not going to mean in light of all these different considerations. And so, when we think about what does it cost to have a child, it can also be thinking about if I need to relocate because we were talking before this interview started about wildfires. Maybe I'm in a place where, there's just too many fires. The air quality is maybe not good. My child or children have developed asthma, for example, which I understand from your book has become quite an issue for a lot of children in certain parts of the US, and I'm sure globally as well. Looking at things like, what were some of the other factors you mentioned? Thinking about like, if I am part of it's like such a communal effort. If there's a natural disaster that happens, am I going to be able to get or be able to access support based on the color of my skin or the neighborhood that I live in? Those, I think, are really important questions to be asking, because those are going to be, when we think about this vision of having kids or not, how those factors play in are going to be shaping like the steps that we're taking moving forward and which path we're going to be moving down.
I also wanted to make it clear, I think that people should have the families that they desire, but you cannot close your eyes, bury your head in the sand and say it'll all work out, it will be okay. It will not work out or be okay on its own. You actually will have to have a plan. You actually will have to face and confront climate change head on, whether you want to or not. Here in the US, we have had two major destructive and extremely deadly hurricanes in the past month, both of which my sister had to evacuate from. She and her family live in Florida. She has 2 children. I have a number of friends who live in Florida and who have children. And the calculus changes when you and your family have to evacuate or have to confront a disaster head on. I certainly have other friends here on the West Coast in California and up and down the Pacific coast of the US who deal with wildfires and who really worry and are deeply concerned, not just with the fire itself. The bigger impact from wildfires is air pollution and the lingering effects of air pollution, because that smoke lingers in the air for days and weeks and really exposes people to a lot of harmful particulate matter. And so asthma is quite common. These various climate impacts negatively even affect pregnancy too. They affect fertility, safe pregnancies, safe delivery. So what I'm saying is we have to become better aware and better informed so that we can manage the realities of our lives. And the realities of our lives include climate change. That's the thing. The book is not here to frighten people. It's here to, I think, increase an awareness and an acceptance of what we are living in now and will continue to live in the future, and to make informed decisions about what we need to live with that sense of joy and happiness, however we can create it. For some people, children are necessary for happiness and joy, but your anxiety having children in this climate crisis will increase. And so what are you going to do to give yourself the kind of support that you need in order to manage that? And then on the other side, I interviewed other people who felt that deciding not to have children was very freeing. It was a sense of relief. And for them, they also didn't want to close their eyes or bury their heads in the sand. For many of them, not having children freed up time to be activists, to engage in climate organizing, or to engage with their communities and families in different ways, and to also maintain a presence in the lives of children, but not of their own. And so, again, I just want to make sure that readers understand this is not a gloom and doom book. This book rejects gloom and doom. It also rejects individualism, the sense of isolation that comes from saying I'm the only person who feels this way, or my own individual actions have caused this, which they have not. That's another thing that I think is important. We have to put the onus, the responsibility for climate change and climate impact back on the industries and government actors and corporate actors that are causing the problem to begin with.
All right, I have a very important invitation to make, and that is to join us for one of our upcoming Kids or Child-Free workshops. If you have not attended one of these 2-hour workshops and you are unsure whether you should have kids or stay child-free, this is the next thing on your to-do list to getting clear on the right choice for you. Head to kidsorchildfree.com. I will also link to our workshop page in the show notes and get all the details on this 2-hour live online workshop that's going to help you get more clarity and direction in terms of whether a future with kids or a future without them is the right path for you. Tickets are only $45, and we have these workshops every month or two, so you should be able to find a date and time that works for you. If you can't join the upcoming date, make sure you sign up for emails so that you can get notified when the next date is announced. I have so many different questions for you, I should say. Even to your last point, I think this is a big frustration a lot of people feel, is that if we need to put the responsibility back onto those players, and yet we feel like nothing's helping to have, like, it makes it feel even more out of one's control. And so what would you suggest if we shouldn't feel individual shame per se for having contributed to climate change, which I'm going to guess you're also not saying that the individuals as a collective, of course, have played a role, but me personally, it's not like just me, Keltie McGuire, has like devastated the environment. It's all of us, which it's being in large part driven by just bigger decision making that's being done on corporate and government levels, correct?
Yes.
And so what's a girl to do then if I'm like sitting over here, trying to like rinse my recycling, which my husband says, don't rinse it, it's using more water. And I say, well, I was brought up to rinse my recycling. People message me if your team rinse recycling or not. Do you rinse your recycling, Jade, or you just toss it in the bin? Okay, I probably should.
It kind of depends, to be honest. If it's stinky or if there's like a lot of stuck on food or sometimes, yes.
Okay, sidebar. But yeah, I mean, how would you say that we as individuals can like feel like we're making a positive change or contribution when we feel like things are so largely out of our hands?
First and foremost, don't try to do it as an individual. You need to be in community. Human beings are social animals. We need to feel a sense of connection and togetherness with others in order, A, to make a difference on any issue, but also B, to not feel this overwhelming sense of aloneness and isolation, which can lead to lots of other distressing emotions. So being in community with others. And there are resources for that. One of my favorites is what are called climate cafes. And these are online groups. They were started by the Climate Psychology Alliance of North America, in which people can come together with people online in groups, people who you don't know. The goal is not to talk about all of your impressive climate activism and organizing or all
I rinse my recycling.
None of that. None of that virtue.
Okay, I won't. I'll leave it at home.
It's not a virtue signaling. It's not what are you doing. It's how are you doing. That is the point of climate cafes, to really come together and form networks of care and community with other human beings. That's number one. Number two, we don't know how large activist campaigns or large, sort of forms of organizing will impact our world in the future. What might look like a setback or something that's unsuccessful now, you don't know how it will have impacts down the line. So what I'm referring to here is another Canadian by the name of Emma Lim is someone who I profiled in the book. Emma is a youth climate activist in Canada. She's one of the leaders of youth climate strikes there. She and her cohort co-organized some of the biggest climate strikes that have happened in Canada, including one that had 300,000 participants in Montreal a number of years ago. But she also created a campaign called No Future, No Children. And what she did there, it was a pledge that simply said, I refuse to have children until my government leaders enact climate change legislation. Their goal, she and her friends who created the campaign, it wasn't to say we don't want kids. That's not what they were saying at all. What they were saying was, this is important enough that we want to bring national attention to this issue so that our parents and older generations of adults can attach their vote to their climate values. We want them to care about climate change. We want them to hold politicians' feet to the fire. We want them to say, we won't vote for you until you have a progressive climate platform. And they chose children as the lens or the vehicle through which to do that, because they said, look, this is already a pressing emotional concern for us. It's not for older people, but what is pressing and emotional for them is the question of whether they will have grandchildren or not. So if we let them know that climate change might be something that will keep them from having the grandchildren that they want, maybe they will vote differently. Maybe they will advocate differently to their elected officials, elected representatives. Maybe they will start to understand, like we do, that every election is a climate election. And so that campaign is no longer running. It didn't work in the short term in that way, but it created a huge discussion. They thought it might get attention from maybe 400 or 500 people who would sign the pledge locally in Canada. They got 10,000 signatures from around the world, and people really started to pay attention. And so again, wins and losses maybe don't happen on the short, immediate time scale that we hope for, but impacts, I think, can be so much bigger, so much broader, and so much longer lasting than what we might realize. And that can only happen when we come together with other people and reject isolation and individualism.
Yeah. I want to just turn back to something that we touched on, was the idea that, certainly not all people are rejecting having children in the face of climate change and climate anxiety, and that for a lot of people, the idea of having a child, and not just the idea, but actually experiencing parenthood and raising a child, can be very hopeful and joyful, especially in the face of a lot of duress and stress and anxiety. And so I want you to just kind of speak to that idea. And I have to say, for myself, I guess what comes up is perhaps a bit of a philosophical or moral ethical question, which I don't necessarily anticipate you can give us a clear answer on. But I would love your weigh in. And that is the idea of I know a lot of people talked about in some of these interviews, specifically white people, may I add, which I'm a white lady, but this idea of is it fair to the child or to have a child based on what may be a very tumultuous, uncertain, scary, dangerous world, in the future. And so this idea, and I know it's something that came up in a past conversation I had about climate change on the podcast, is when we think about hope or optimism, it's for whom? And if it's hope and optimism and joy for me, what about the ramifications or potential repercussions of my child based on an uncertain future? What do you think, or how do we weigh out this sort of question of child as a symbol of hope with this notion of, is it right, moral, or fair to have a child?
Yeah. So I think this question of whether it's fair or moral or right to have a child in difficult or frightening circumstances is one that there's nothing new about that question. And I think that as you describe, how maybe young white people are asking that question, one of the big differences is that young white people might be asking that question because this is the first time that they're really confronting existential threat. And also an awareness that their government leaders, trusted elders, are in fact not acting to protect them and are in many cases enacting policies that directly put them in danger. And that's a shocking realization to come to for the first time. But Black communities, Indigenous communities, First Nations communities have already, and for a very long time, been experiencing existential threats and asking these questions around bringing children into a world or into societies that will make it hard for them to grow up with all the resources that they need, not just to survive, but to thrive. And what one of the answers that has been common in marginalized communities is, the future will have to be better than what the past has been for us. We are pinning our hopes on the future for our children, that they won't experience the discrimination, the violence, the privations, all of the horrors and abuses that our communities have experienced for decades. On the other hand, another answer that is common in marginalized communities is, well, it's really important to pass on our culture and our cultural traditions. And if this world will exist in any form in the future, we need to be here too. That becomes really important. And then the other sort of really important response that I have heard over and over from communities of color is, well, we're not going to get through this without our families. We can't get through this without our families, and children are vital parts of that family. Our family is our first community, our first network, our first, sort of community of care and concern, and our buffer against all of the challenges of the outside world. Why would we reduce our buffer of care and love and support when we need it most? So it's a different way of looking at that set of questions. The questions are valid, absolutely. But in that instance, I really do invite those who are struggling with existential questions for the first time to sort of look to the experiences of those communities that have grappled with that for generations.
Yeah. Thank you for that and for all of those different perspectives, because for myself, I mean, certainly we can't neglect what's happening in reality, but I really believe that the way we approach this question, sort of the mindset or perspective, how we're asking this question, even one thing we talk about a lot here on the show is like this idea that there's like a right and a wrong, and there's a good and a bad, and debunking all of those notions and really opening yourself up to the possibility, in the example I just gave, that like we can have a beautiful, fulfilling life with either decision. I think similarly, regarding how we view this decision and what it means for the future to have a child or not have a child, we can see that in positive, negative, and all kinds of lights. And so I think that's something really important for people to consider and to sort of see what their own, even just hearing Jade speak, sort of what emotions that brought up when she shared those different examples. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Something we haven't touched on, and people might be thinking, oh, she's not going to ask her because we talk about this at the beginning of every episode. But today we flip things around. And that is, Jade, we haven't talked at all about your own kids or child-free decision. And first of all, are you a parent yourself? And I'm curious how you arrived at the decision to have or not have children.
I'm not a parent. And to be honest with you, I never arrived at a decision. It was just sort of life just...
kept moving.
Life just kept moving, and it was never a yes. And that's the thing. I think that sometimes people assume that child-free people one day stood up and declared, no, I will never, ever have children or parent children. That's not necessarily the case for everyone. I think that for a lot of people, myself included, there was never a day that I said, yes, I want to have a child. Let's start working on this right now today. And so in the absence of a strong, clear yes, it is a no for me. Yeah.
I mean, you've just debunked, I think, a big myth that a lot of people have around this decision. Now, of course, there are very much more clear decision points, or at least action points with having a child. But I agree, for myself, even although I did reach a point where, because I'd been on the fence for so long, I realized, okay, I've got to make a decision. It wasn't like there was a singular moment in time or day. I can think about a few sort of, and I've shared them many times on here, but like sort of insights, aha moments, or like turning points in my decision, if you will. But it was almost more like turning a temperature dial that got increasingly in favor of that child-free path over the course of time, also based on decisions that I was making and the sort of life path that I had set myself on, as well as found myself on. So I really appreciate you giving voice to the fact that it's not necessarily the singular decision point for many child-free folks.
And also, though, I do have to say, it's harder to sort of have that one singular decision point when there is so much overwhelming pressure all the time.
Yeah.
And maybe this is generational. I hope it is. I hope that it's gotten easier for young people. I hope that they're not overwhelmed with pressure constantly. But, someone like myself, born in the late 70s, people have never hesitated throughout my life to ask me if I'm having children, when I'm having children, why I don't have children. These are very personal questions.
100%.
And
yeah, I feel bad asking them on the podcast, but I've asked permission to do so.
Well, no, this is the
forum for it. No, I know, but it is. Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
And I think that honestly, if I had never felt that pressure from all of those questions, I think at some point it would have been easier to say a firm, clear no, and to keep saying it over and over and over again. But I think the absence of that firm, clear decision of no is in part because of the daily erosion of the constant asking and pressure and why is this such an issue for you? This is my life. Why do you care so much?
Yeah. 100%. No, I totally agree. And I think it creates a lot of insecurity and the sort of back and forth. And I hear from so many women, specifically who choose child-free, that's like, I thought I made a decision and then I had dinner with my in-laws and then somebody made a comment or, and it's like this, it's like, I don't know, like something festers when somebody's like picking and poking at you all the time. So
yes.
Okay, well, and then of course the last question that I know, people will just kill me if I don't ask this, is that how much has climate change and climate anxiety played into your decision?
It has not. However, and I address this in the book, whenever there is anything going on that's related to climate change, a heat wave or potential wildfire or an actual wildfire or any of the ways that I experience climate change, all I feel is overwhelming relief that I don't have children. That's the role that it plays for me. I am enthusiastically child-free in that sense.
Yeah.
And with that said, I certainly embrace and am concerned for the children of friends and family members, the children in my life. But I am very happy that I do not have children of my own, because I know that managing all of this climate stuff on top of just all of the aspects of my everyday life, it would be really difficult. I would be exhausted and I would be worried all the time. And I'm happy to not feel that way.
I like that you touched on it just now and earlier on our conversation. And that is the idea that, like, to think that child-free people or anyone without kids, whether through choice or circumstance, is not invested in the future, doesn't care about future generations, doesn't care about what's happening in our world presently. I think that is vastly untrue. And I think, yes, we want, and what I'm hearing is should be taking into consideration, not necessarily just so much of if I'm having kids or not due to what's happening in the environment, but more like, how am I going to respond if I do have kids? What are some different factors I need to take into account? How can I best not just support myself, but my future children, in the instance that I have kids? But we also, as people who are not having children, certainly are, invested in the future and should be grappling with and considering all of these different issues and layers of this problem.
I think that's an extremely important point. Here in the US, as everyone knows, we have this big election coming up tomorrow. Very important.
And this is airing after, so say something good as like a happy foreshadowing. No pressure.
Happy? I'd have to think about that one.
Yeah, you don't have to. It's okay.
But
just FYI, it'll be airing after.
Okay. But I do want to say this.
Yeah.
I mean, in the run-up to our election, there has been this wildly ridiculous narrative put forward by J.D. Vance about childless cat ladies. Mm-hmm. And, his comments about childless cat ladies were meant to be disparaging and rude and to make it seem like we don't have anything going on in our lives. But he also was saying that people without children are less invested in the country. And he was, in fact, advocating for child-free people to have fewer political rights. So I'm saying that to say it actually matters and is political that we say people without children are deeply invested in our societies, in our communities, in our world, and in making all of them a better place, even in the face of these wild statements to the contrary. And unfortunately, we have to combat those statements.
Yeah. I think if there's, a positive light in all of that, I do think the fact, or seeing how women of all, and folks of all different choices and life paths have really, for the most part, not in entirety, but banded together in that it's like, I'm proud to not have children. And if that's the choice I've made, that there's nothing wrong with having done that we need to support one another's reproductive decision-making. I feel like in some sense, this is all really backfired, or probably positively for giving voice to people's different decisions on this topic of kids or child-free.
Absolutely. And I can tell you, as a college professor, I am really gratified walking into my classroom and hearing how fired up my students are about reproductive rights, reproductive justice, advocating among their peers who are in their late teens, early 20s. I think it's terrible that they have even had 2 years of living in a country in which access to abortion is not a federal right. Hopefully by the time this airs, Kamala Harris is the president of the United States, and we'll start working to reverse that horrible Supreme Court decision. But I am, however, gratified to say that young people across the political spectrum are very much committed to reproductive rights and the right to access contraception and abortion and to build or not build the family of their choosing. And I'm excited about that.
Yeah, makes me very hopeful and optimistic as well. Before I ask you our rapid fire questions to wrap up, I just want to ask you, is there something that you had wanted to share about the latest research you're doing? You mentioned at the beginning, I'm not sure if there's something you want to share a little bit on that front, or if there's an invitation, if we can partake or share, spread the word.
Well, it's a brand new project. All I can say is that I am working with a group of really exciting young people. They are climate justice activists and advocates working at the high school and college levels. And I'm working with them to help them do surveys and interviews of climate leaders, campus climate leaders in colleges and universities. And what we're finding so far is just pretty much bolstering and supporting every conclusion I draw in my book, which is that climate activism is really important, but it's not an antidote to climate emotions, that climate activists still feel a lot of distress and anxiety, but they find joy and solace in the communities that they develop by becoming climate engaged. I think what's also really important is that these interviews are clearly demonstrating that young people are very concerned about climate change and that concern very much shapes how they feel about having children. That's all in the book, but this new research just drives that point home. That is something that is not going to change unless the climate reality changes. So people have often asked me, what's the solution? What's the solution to these distressing climate emotions? What's the solution? How can we get young people to want to have children or feel good about children? The solution is to address climate change. I mean, the emotions aren't the problem at all. And the reproductive concerns aren't the problem. Climate change is the problem. And our political and economic systems are the problem. Living in fossil fuel economies, that's the problem. So that's my response to that question. Emotions are not problems to be solved. They're just not.
Amen. I agree. That funny you talking about reproductive justice, abortion, and the emotions not being a problem piggybacks perfectly on the conversation that will probably have aired just before this one. My conversation with Becca, the sweet feminist on Instagram, who talks about her experience of having had an abortion at 20, becoming a mom in her 30s, and just how important it is that we have these rights. So love how these conversations all tie together very, very beautifully. Okay, Jade, now time for our infamous rapid fire questions.
Okay.
It's very exciting. Okay, so the first two are finish this sentence. Being child-free is?
Amazing.
Being child-free is not?
Sad.
What is one tool or resource that you think might help people who are on the fence about whether or not to have kids? And maybe we'll say specifically in light of climate concerns.
Yeah. Just one tool or resource. I would say the Climate Mental Health Network.
Okay, amazing. We will link to that in the show notes today. What is one thing that you would like parents to know?
Oh my goodness. I feel such empathy, sympathy, empathy. And I want parents to know that there are resources for you. Parenthood is not something that solves climate anxiety. It's not as if a person says, oh, I'm going to be a parent or I'm now a parent, therefore I no longer feel climate distress.
Good point.
And the thing about it is there are so many tools and resources now because there's so much awareness of climate anxiety and how this impacts parenting. And so, again, that organization that I mentioned, the Climate Mental Health Network, they specifically have an area of their tools and resources that are entirely for parents, and another area for K through 12 educators, people who work with children or have children of their own. So any parents who are really dealing with climate anxiety or other distressing emotions, you don't have to sort of deal with that or suffer with it on your own. There are tools and resources to help you, and you can find them on their website.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right, lastly, if you could give one piece of advice to someone who's currently on the fence about whether or not to have kids, what would that be?
Talk to other people. Don't suffer alone. Your silence and isolation will not help you. This is something that you're not dealing with by yourself, so don't deal with it by yourself. Talk to other people. And also be very selective about who you talk to. Don't talk to that older family member who you know is going to pressure you into doing what they want. Talk to people you can relate to. Talk to people who share your concerns, who share your lived experiences, but don't suffer in silence.
Thank you. You are such a wonderful guest. This is a fantastic conversation. Where can people find you? Where can they buy your book? Anything else you want to share with them?
Yeah, thank you. So they can find me at jadesasserphd.com. If they would like to buy the book, they can go to the UC Press website. And they can actually get a 30% discount. So the code, if you go to the UC Press website and look for the book, Climate Anxiety and the Kid Question, Deciding Whether to Have Children in an Uncertain Future, the discount code is UCP Save 30.
Amazing. Okay, and we're going to include the code in the show notes. So if you were scrambling to jot that down in your phone or to find a pen, we'll make sure to include the link as well as the code so you can hopefully save 30, read the book, and enjoy it as much as I did. So thank you, Dr. Jade Sasser, for coming on today.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, now that we've wrapped up today's conversation, this is the part of the episode where I tell you that you need to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. And you really need to do that. And I'm going to tell you why. And that is because one of the big ways that people find and discover new podcasts like this one is through reviews. So if you yourself can go say what you loved about this podcast, why people who are on the fence should tune into the Kids Are Child-Free podcast, that's going to help other people who are also wondering, should I have kids or stay child-free, to discover us. Thank you in advance for doing so. I will be featuring some of the reviews in upcoming episodes, so maybe I'll share yours. You never know. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you back here soon for our next episode.